How's everybody doing? Good. So one thing just to make sure you have on your radar, do people know what starts next week on Thursday? Yeah, presentations. So two people have presentations, one which is somebody who attends remotely. So we'll try to figure out how to do that with Blackboard Collaborate for that person. So make sure you check the list. If you're an at-home person, you're the other person presenting, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, that's what I thought. So so we'll do that Thursday. We only have two on Thursday, so it'll probably won't take up all of class time, and we'll probably afterwards, whatever time we have left, I'll probably round out whatever the articles for next week as well. So, and then after that, we have for 2 more weeks, we're going to have it on Thursdays, right? So, and then we go 1 week where both days are going to be presentations, and then the Tuesday before Thanksgiving break, we'll have presentations, and then class will be over. So we're only talking about 4 more articles total after what we're going to talk about today. So we're really kind of winding down towards the end. And then, yeah, so then we'll have the take-home period. Just to remind people, the take-home for here, it's not going to be a cumulative take-home. It's going to be just like the other take-home that we saw for midterm, except it'll cover the second half of the semester. And that will be due the day of our exam period. So that's how we're going to run that. Also remember, for those of you who did not get me the term paper the first time, next Friday will be the date that you'll have to have it to me by. So. And if you have not emailed me yet about wanting detailed notes, I think I said this before, I brought it up this morning, but I used to be an assistant editor for a journal, so I'm very good at giving like detailed feedback on the argument, not the grammar. Like, I'm not a grammar person. You know, I grew up, you know, poor and white, so I went to a bad school, so I learned grammar first as German grammar. And then I had to learn the parts of the sentence when I took a foreign language. I still don't even really know like how American grammar completely differs. So like there are things that I sometimes think of as American English-speaking grammar that, you know, isn't. So I'm not a grammarian, so I'm not going to give you like real detailed note and things like sentence structure. But I'll let you know, like, you know, basically like how you could be more clear and how you present your argument and stuff like that. So if you want those kinds of notes, and you are somebody who turned in a draft already, let me know. Since we're not doing the revisions. Okay. Any practical questions for me before we leap into talking about whiteness again? Yeah.
So do we need, if we did turn it in the first time, do we actually need to turn it in to the revisions again, or is it already just?
Yeah, I'm just going to give you the points for the revision if you did it the first time. It's kind of like a reward. Partially because when I went to grade it, there were so few in there that I assumed that it wasn't due yet. You know, because like every week I go through and like I click on Blackboard. This is how I figure out whether I have grading due, right? It's like every Monday I go through and like look and see what needs to be graded. Well, there's only 10 in there. I was like, oh, it must be due next week. And didn't look at the syllabus. And so it would basically, I felt like by the time I got your feedback, it would probably be a little too late to ask you to revise, which is why, one of the reasons why I said, well, I'll just give people the points for the revision if they got it in. Yeah?
Wait, so are they graded right now, or?
They haven't been graded.
Oh, okay.
So.
Will that, like, will looking at kind of like our, like what we messed up on, will that like help us with our presentation? Like, should we change stuff about it, or?
I mean, it's probably not unless the paper's really bad.
Okay.
Then it might help, but otherwise, like it's more just like kind of for you to know you're writing better, I guess, as an offer. So, it's more, yeah. So. And I'm gonna do the detailed notes for people. I have two people who requested that already. I'm gonna do those first, and then I'll go through a quick grade what remains. And so, at some point, probably early next week, you'll get the grade on the term paper if you turned it in. So. a little bit earlier if you're gonna get detailed notes probably. So. Yeah.
And then like for the presentation, does it matter what we wear?
Not really. You see, it's sort of like I feel like professional standards kind of stuff. So like I run the presentations like a conference, right? So like I have people. Did I already say this when I talked about presentations before? I time people out like a conference presider would. I have you guys present one at a time and then go back up for Q&A just like you would at a presentation. As a sociologist though, like professional standards for dress, like there's kind of a gamut. At the last institution I worked at, psychology had like a professionalization course and they made students wear suits and like all this sort of things when they did that. And I was like, if I did that, I'd have to teach my students to grow dreadlocks. It's kind of like the joke I would say, because like if you actually saw like a sociology graduate program, it's often like a lot of the people are kind of granola. So, but you'll get people who like show up to conferences just like they normally would, you know, like I've seen people present in overalls, you know, like Carhartt overalls. So like, you know, it really kind of depends on what your subfield is and stuff like that within sociology, what your professional standards are. But yeah, so I guess like kind of know your own field. If you guys feel like it would be more beneficial for you to practice like getting all gussied up and whatnot, then go ahead and do that. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
How long do the presentations have to be?
I believe I had said 10 to 15, right? For upper to mid, yep. So 10 to 15 minutes per presentation. And we'll have to move through them at a pretty good pace. So like, and I think I said this before, make sure you're here early. I know it's 8 o'clock and it's a painful thing to ask, but like we have to have everybody, if you're gonna be using PowerPoint, it has to be up before we start. I want all the presenters here before we start. You guys are gonna decide on your own order. Like I'm not gonna tell you guys which one gets to go first or something like that, because that's not how it would normally work, right? If you were presenting in a professional setting. So yeah, so be here, be on time, right? If you come in like 15, 20 minutes late, I might just like not let you present. Like seriously, so unless you have a really good reason, if it's just sort of like I overslept and I wandered in, sorry, right? Like so yeah, so make sure that you're here on time because we have to get, essentially to get through everybody's, we can't have a 10-minute pause between each as people get their PowerPoint presentations up. Plus, it's really dull for everybody in the audience, right? Other questions? Cool. Once again, though, don't be overly intimidated by the presentation because, like, I'm not a speech teacher, so I'm not gonna like mark you down as like a speech teacher would. So, you know, I more just care that you seem interested in what you're doing and that you present something that's coherent. So, okay, any other questions? Great, let's go ahead and jump back into talking about whiteness. So, let's reiterate what we were talking about in terms of whiteness studies so far. If you're looking to get the article up, we're still continuing on with Ingram's Racializing Babylon. So how is whiteness different? Why is it important to talk about whiteness? I always feel like it must be really awkward to be a whiteness studies person because like I think people would assume that like you're a white supremacist or something. It sounds like a really weird thing to say that you study, right? Like it's obviously not what whiteness studies is, but like it kind of sounds like there's like men's studies for a while, which was like a refutation to like women's studies. Right? It's kind of the same idea. Kind of feels the same way. Even though it's not. So what was whiteness?
We kind of talked about it being like perceived as like pure and innocent, and then I guess the other word, translucent.
Yeah, so we talked about like the portrayal of whiteness as innocent. And what was the significance of translucent, it being translucent?
It's like see-through. So was that kind of like saying that like some people are like, oh, like white people, like it's not even a race. And then like white people, they're like, oh, we can talk about any race because like they think that it's like people think that white people are like the representation of everyone or something like that.
Yeah. So because whiteness is often perceived as not being a race, right? Like we don't think of it as a racial category. Because of that, like it's in a weird way, it sort of allows whiteness to stand proxy for everyone, right? So whenever we're talking about something universalistically, right, as if everyone had the same values, as if everyone had the same culture, as if, right, usually what we're actually doing is we're just sort of supplanting white values to represent everybody. So whiteness, because we're like, in a lot of ways, whiteness studies wants to claim that we have a blindness when we talk about whiteness. Right? That we're blind to the fact that whiteness is a race and is a category and functions largely like other races and categories with the exception of it being dominant. So there's a weird sort of lie to whiteness. Yeah, so that was one of the major categories. So we were talking about Richard Dyer, right? And Richard Dyer is one of the people who promoted this, who started whiteness studies. And Richard Dyer was talking about whiteness being everything and nothing, right? It stands for everything, but it's also seen as an empty category. And so there's this weird thing going on. Okay. Anything else people want to add from the last lecture? Okay, let's start out then on page 160 of the article. And I'm gonna, from the the only full paragraph on the page, right? So, as I have explained, right, you see there I'm at. So, I'm going to look for another volunteer to read again. So, who wants to read? Yeah, go ahead.
As I explained above, Morrison suggests that for American writers in the 19th century, the problem with whiteness, or rather what is meant to be Morrison's phrase, a new white man, an American was whiteness, impenetrability, its boundarylessness. Americans needed something against which to find their new identities. Whiteness, it would appear, represented in the vast expanses of the unmarked frontier, threatened to engulf the newly emerging identity of the white American man. Whiteness was synonymous with blankness, an identity not yet found. Ruth Frankenberg has noted that to many late 20th century white Americans, whiteness also represents nothingness. If it is the mark of anything, it is the mark of lack, of cultureness, formless existence. Because whites find themselves in existence as universal human, they cannot lay claim to the specificity of marked culture attributes. As one of the white...
I'm going to pause you there. Great. And then I'm going to have us jump down a little bit to this word. Actually, no, I take that back. I'm going to include what I originally cut out. So, if you don't mind.
Because white find themselves in a position of... As one of the white women interviewed by Frankenberg makes clear, Americans supposed to be the melting pot. I know that I've got a huge number of nationalities in my blood, but what do I call myself? And hating this country as I do not like to say I'm an American because I have so much objection to Americans' place in the world. Especially growing up in the 60s when people did say, I'm proud to be black, I'm proud to be Hispanic, but there's still a majority of the country that can't say they're proud of anything. Clearly, whites perceive other ethnic groups as making an unproblematic understanding of their national and cultural identity, precisely because such groups see themselves as being not transparent or invisible like whites are, but different, racialized.
Thank you very much. So what's being said here? So we're getting a little more specificity going on. So it's a similar concept to what we've been working in already. How's it? What's the detail? What's the difference? Yeah.
Kind of talked about how like white people don't have like the same background and not the same culture because it's all one from like past like generations of just like I guess different European ancestors, I would assume, and like how like now in the United States like you see like Latinos or blacks and they all have that same culture, but whites don't. I guess that's what it's saying.
Yeah, so that's like the quote. So so the Ruth Frankenberg, another major figure in whiteness studies, did these surveys of white women, right? And that's what that quote is from. So yeah, what's the quote saying, or what does the quote feel like in the middle? It's probably a better way to put it. What's the feeling you get off of that, the words? Because now we're moving, so if you will, like we were talking like objectively, right, about whiteness, but here we're kind of moving into like perceptional thing, right? How does this feel? Do you want me to read it aloud again so you can kind of get a feeling for it again? America's supposed to be a melting pot. I know that I've got a huge number of nationalities in my blood, but what do I call myself? And hating this country as I do, I don't like to say that I'm an American because I have so much objection to America's place in the world, especially growing up in the 60s, when people did say, I'm proud to be black, I'm proud to be Hispanic. But there's still a majority of the country that can't say they're proud to be anything. What does it sound like? What's the feeling behind it?
Yeah. It's a pretty negative feeling, I'd say, towards the country as a whole.
So yeah, there is a negative feeling towards the country. Like, I think that's not how what our author wants us to draw, but that's definitely in there.
Saying that because there's no like white culture, one objective white culture.
Yeah, it's like they're upset because they feel like they lack something, right? Like, and this is something that like when people like white people have been interviewed in whiteness studies, this is a theme that regularly comes up. This feeling of like they interpret this sort of like, so we were talking like whiteness doesn't appear to be anything positive, right? It's translucent, right? And this has often appeared, while symbolically is often treated as positive at an objective level, subjectively people often experience this as in a threatening, lacking sort of way. And people become defensive about it in a strange way, like they're missing out on something, right? So if we were to leap down to the bottom of this paragraph, right, there's a quote once again from Richard Dreier, which says that that this absence proves right, isn't it proves itself white people's greatest weakness, and it is for in it lies a desolate suspicion of non-existence. Do you guys get the kind of the feeling there? So what's the, if you will, like, what's the other side of being basically marked as non-raced, as neutral. Just taking the way this paragraph goes. What does that do to people subjectively? Yeah.
On the other side would be having a race or being put into a group, sort of collectivized based on your race.
Maybe I worded my question poorly. How do white people subjectively experience being not a race, according to this paragraph? Or even getting back to like, what does that quote sound like?
Maybe it's like they don't feel like they have like an identity.
And so basically the idea is like that's a threatening thing, right? So the idea is that like in some weird like almost, if you want to claim like almost at an unconscious level, white people are defensive according to whiteness studies, right? Because they're threatened by the idea that in essence like they're threatened by the idea that symbolically whiteness doesn't exist, right? So you get this sort of defensive reaction. Another one of Dyer's formulations. So Dyer did so as we were talking, he's a film critic. He did has anyone ever seen the movie Night of the Living Dead? He did a racialized critique of the movie Night of the Living Dead. And in that he was like, he wanted to, and so like it's the quote at the bottom, non-existence is kind of like nodding at this, right? Like it's in some ways symbolically like whiteness is also kind of like death. Right? Like absence, non-existence, right? Like it's death. And Dyer, one of Dyer's phrases is he's like, whiteness is death and the bringer of death, right? So thinking about it like the idea is kind of like there's a defensiveness that comes from that non-existence, but that defensiveness gets transformed into hostility often, right? So there's a feeling like one is being threatened. You can think about this like, has anyone ever heard people, and that's kind of what it means by this desolate suspicion of non-existence, right? There's this feeling, and you get this language a lot, like, has anyone ever heard people talk about like that in X number of years, white people are going to be a minority? Has anyone ever heard that line? Like, this appears in like the news sometimes. When I was, at my last job, I went to an evangelism conference for the religious organization I was working for. And like, there was literally somebody giving a presentation about whether the church group was going to die out because there weren't going to be enough white people in the future, right? That kind of language shows what's trying to be captured here, right? It's like there is, just because of the place of white not being demarcated, right? White being translucent, right? Not really being thought of as a culture that exists. It leads people to feel threatened, right? And the idea is like the rest of the world, these sort of like positive cultures are honing in on the world, right? And like, because it's universalistic. Think about this too, like this language comes up a lot when we talk about universal values. So if you get sort of like has anybody ever heard stuff surrounding the idea of relativism? People talking about negatively about something called relativism. I see a nod. Do you want to take a stab at that?
I mean, just pretty much, it's like people will, can believe whatever they want to believe. It's just whatever your interpretation is. Yeah. I don't know. It's like, it's like people saying like, well, I believe this, and like you can believe whatever you want. There's no like objective truth. It's just like.
Yeah, so this is how relativism often gets talked about, and within a feeling of that, and so a lot of times people will accuse things like multiculturalism with relativism, right? right? So this multiculturalism is basically sort of like the inclusion of other cultures. There's a lot of negative things we can say about multiculturalism in a race and ethnicity class, but in this moment, I'd like to just kind of like focus on the fact that like people often take the inclusion of other cultural values, the inclusion of other cultural elements as itself relativism, this sort of like, wow, it's letting go of like objective truth, right? Well, that kind of idea shows, right, this idea of feeling kind of threatened by outside ethnicities, positive ethnicities, right? And because whiteness has sort of been allowed to sort of like count for everything, right? It's sort of like any admission that other people's worldviews might be true, right, becomes suspect, right? As if there's this long historical truth that everybody agreed upon, right? Everybody, that's being threatened or degraded by the inclusion of other people, right? You guys kind of see what I'm pointing at to? So like that is same language, right? Once again, is sort of an example of the ways in which, at a symbolic level, whiteness being universalized actually creates this weird sort of fear, right? And so Dyer would want to connect that with the idea of its non-existence, that there's this sort of like nagging suspicion within people, right? That because it doesn't have a strong positive assertion of what it is, that it's constantly under threat. Make sense? So our article is an extension of this idea. And in particular, it's applying it to a different setting. Did anybody capture what setting this is? First of all, and this is a little bit different than a lot of our articles, did anybody catch what our article is specifically looking at? Like, what's its object of analysis? What thing is it studying? And where is it studying it?
In Babylon?
What's that?
In Babylon?
It's not Babylon. Babylon's it's a reference to something else.
Was it like nationalism in like Australia?
Yeah, so it's looking at national identity in Australia, white national identity in Australia. Anyway, what it's looking at it through.
Kind of looking at it through like maybe a settler's perspective, like people who moved there.
Yeah.
Settled there, I guess.
Yeah, so that's an important piece. So yeah, it's in Australia. It's looking at the perspective of settlers. What is settlers referring to here in Australia?
If you're referring to people who've come from Britain or other places, because Australia has a decently sized indigenous population, so people who've interacted with them, maybe.
Yeah, so yeah, so it's interested in settlers. By settlers, it's really meaning that sort of like period of settler colonialism in Australia, right? So we're looking at when it was colonized. So initially in colonialism, what would have been the predominant population in Australia? Probably would have initially been indigenous peoples, right? And then it moved the other direction largely as like, you know, like for a long time in the 19th century, it was legal to shoot indigenous people for sport in Australia. Now, indigenous people only make up less than 3% of the population of Australia, so they're actually a pretty small minority. Smaller than even Native Americans in the United States. Australia is colonized. Does anybody know when Australia is colonized? Mostly. This is kind of a piece of the puzzle here. It's colonized. Does anybody know, is anybody aware of Australia versus the United States? Which one's older? Australia was colonized in the 19th century, as opposed to the United States, which was colonized starting in the 15th century, so significantly later, right? So that's kind of part of the argument, right? Like in America, to some degree, we've forgotten that we were a settler country, right? We've been capable of, in a lot of ways, like the United States. And that's why I like a lot of times when people talk about the West, they'll talk about Europe and North America, right? And the reason why is because when we're talking about colonized places, it happened so much earlier in North America, and to some degree, like the North American population is so predominantly European, right, that we've sort of forgotten that colonization happened here. We treat it as if it never occurred, which is very different than, according to our article, sort of like identities of people in places like Australia or South Africa, right, which, as we talked about before, have pretty large settler populations from England, right? But, but they happened later, so people are very aware of that. And then it's looking specifically at novels. That was the last thing. So this is an example of something of literary criticism, actually, right? It's significant within a race and ethnicity class, but just like Dyer is a film critic, most of the whiteness studies stuff grows out of sort of like art criticism stuff. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys go one page further. Oh, and you said about Babylon. The Babylon is more like the title itself is kind of a poetic thing. So what's the significance of Babylon? What just not within the article. Just the article doesn't really mention it much. It has to do with like one of the titles of one of the novels, but just to kind of get the tie-in. What happened? When we talk about Babylon, who goes to Babylon? There's a school where you have to take religion classes. This should probably like pop up. What ancient people are forced to go to Babylon? The Israelites, right? The Babylonian captivity, right? So like it's getting that feeler of being sort of like a stranger in a strange land, right? It's also, Babylon's also really commonly used in like stuff like reggae music in the same way, right? So like that, in that way it's referring to people like people from Africa being brought over as slaves, right? And they'll talk about them being in the Western Hemisphere as Babylon, right? And so it often gets used symbolically this way. In this way, it's a reference to, in this case, it's a reference to the lack of feeling connected, right, of Australian settlers, which is something that we're going to look at. So let's look at page 161. So this is getting into a particular form of whiteness that works differently, right, than what we were looking at with Dyer, which is settler whiteness. So page 161. The paragraph that starts on this page, if we go a few, let me see, about 8 lines down, the word however, you can see where I'm at? So when somebody wants to read, do people see where I'm pointing to? Not really. So page 161. However is kind of towards the left. The word in front of it, which is the last word of the previous sentence, is privilege.
However, though it is certainly true that all this attention to whiteness makes whiteness itself more visible, that is, no longer transparent, no non-settler attempts to negotiate with whiteness nevertheless differ from settler attempts to do so. Though whites from America or Europe can now be seen to be conscious of themselves as race, I would argue that only the white settler experiences alienation or lack of national identity precisely as a result of his or her being raised as white. Americans certainly experience the power that comes with their whiteness, as do settlers, but Americans do not experience the concomitant sense of national alienation. Indeed, the term settler itself can be seen to perpetuate such alienation. As Grant Farrell explains, via the South Africa, to name white South African settlers is to mark them as aliens when they present themselves as unproblematic nationals. Whether it is simply as a result of the fact that they have been in the process of constructing a national identity far longer than Australians and other settlers have, or simply because American identity, whether rejected by individual Americans or not, in the latter part of the 20th century has been achieved through global domination and capitalist ideology. America has recourse to a definition of itself that Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa do not. Only America embodies an extraordinary economic presence which is inseparable from its Americanness.
Okay, let's pause. So what's being said there? So how's settler whiteness different from other forms of whiteness? There's a few things that we can pull out here. Yeah.
It says in here, it says that Americans certainly experience the power that comes with their whiteness as indigenous settlers, but Americans do not experience the concomitant sense of national alienation.
Yeah.
So kind of,
So what does that mean? What,
it means like, pretty much like Americans experience, Americans do not experience like the sense of national alienation, whereas the white settlers, or I guess they're kind of apart.
you're definitely on the right track. Does anybody want to add? What's this thing about national alienation? What does it mean to say that settlers feel national alienation? Yeah.
It was saying how they come off as being nationally alienated, that they're, maybe I got that wrong. They present themselves as nationals, but they're alienated.
Yeah. What does that mean? What do you think? What could that be referring to?
Maybe referring to like, what we talked about earlier about the predominant culture being quote unquote good, being Western culture, white culture, or whatever, and so they might go into that a little bit.
So what does it mean to be alienated?
It means to be like cast out or just not from the place that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's about not being from a place. How are settlers not from a place? Because there's a double sense that this works in this article. So how can we talk about settlers not being from a place? What places are they not from? What do settlers do?
So
They settle. Where do they settle from? Where do they come from, and where do they settle?
Like from their home country into a new country?
Yeah, so they come from their home country to someplace new. How is that process going to make you feel alienated from a place?
it's new.
Is that?
It's new. It's a new place. Never been there. Old customs are gone or not gone, but you're leaving the comfort of your old place.
So yeah, you don't necessarily belong. Anybody here ever move? When you show up at a new place, how connected do you feel to that place? Not very, right? Like, you're new there, right? Now imagine that, like, rather than just sort of like moving to a new town, you get on a ship, travel for a half a year, wind up in some place where there's not very many people at all, right, from your original culture, right, where you're actively sort of dominating over and taking, so you're thinking about within the idea of colonialism, we're actively dominating and taking over a larger indigenous population. There's a long history and connection to the place that they're living. Do you feel like you have a history and connection to where you're living? No. Has anybody ever moved away from a place long enough that you no longer feel like your original place is home? Place that you're from? Or the place that you lived before? Eventually, like if you've lived long enough away from some place, you go back to it, it's foreign. Right? Like it looks familiar, but it's like you don't really know anybody there. You know, like I've been feeling this for like probably like the last decade. Every time I go back to Michigan, it's sort of like I know my relatives and my like 3 old friends from high school that I still see, but like everyone else, like if I did know them, I don't know them anymore. Like you know, like people don't recognize me, I don't recognize them. Like the last time I saw them was 20 years ago. Right? Like, so basically what happens is like, I become in a lot of ways sort of, in like habits, like the way I speak even doesn't sound like the people that I'm from anymore completely. I don't dress like the people from where I'm from. I don't, right? Like I've changed and altered as I've moved. So when I go back, I'm kind of like a foreigner in the place that I go back to, right? So you think about how heightened that is for colonials, right? Like they have no, in some ways, no right to claim their original national identity anymore. But they also have no connection to the place that they're from, right? Nor is there an easy sort of like social connection that you can just sort of like step into an existing social network like you can if you move into a town, right? So the point is like that essentially they feel this sort of like weird alienation, right? This disconnection from nationality, right? From their original nationality. So that's one piece of here, right, that we're talking about, so this idea of national alienation. When we talk about, so like, when we talk about in the US context, we talk about settlers, right? Which groups of people pop into your head? I know this is like ancient history of the United States. So what groups of people in the United States at one point were settlers?
People who were like, moving into territory west.
Yeah, the period of Western expansion, right? Manifest destiny, all that jazz, right? Everyone, like that image of people getting in the covered wagons and moving out into the West. When we talk about that history, how do we think about or talk about or perceive the West? The West is what?
Well, say it's like open and free and stuff, but it kind of ignores the fact that there are Native Americans throughout the West.
Yeah, we do have a tendency to downplay the existence of Native Americans. We treat it as something empty, right? It's an empty space. Even like the word, what's the word sometimes we use the word frontier, right? The word frontier to describe it, which the word frontier, even in and of itself, implies this sort of like blank space off in the distance, right? On the edge of like the civilized known world, right? This is kind of how people talk about that, right? And so you're sort of like going out into this sort of like unknown world. But for our article, there's a weird connection here. There's something threatening about this for white identity. And the reason why it's threatening is it gets us back into whiteness studies. What typifies whiteness? It's what? How were we talking about whiteness before? Whiteness is what?
Pure, holy,
What's that?
pure, holy, innocent, transition.
So today, how have we been talking about whiteness? It's what?
Non-existent.
Yeah, so if you want to think of it, this is threatening because you have a category, right? A non-existent category, a blankness, if you will. And once again, this is all talking about it in a sort of like, how does language work, right? This is at a sort of like unconscious level. So we're not saying that like white settlers were like, yep, I'm a blank category. Yep, that's not what happened, right? But like what they are saying is that some subconscious level people didn't think of themselves as an existent group, right? So like to come from taking this sort of like blank, non-existent identity and then sort of like heading it out into a place that you perceived as blank and non-existent was sort of like this weird double threateningness, right? Does this make sense? So this is even a heightened version of that sort of fear and paranoia. And then you combine that with interacting with peoples, because in reality, what's out in the frontier? Is the frontier really a frontier at all?
Native American communities.
Yeah, basically, yeah, you're heading out into a place where there are a lot of native peoples who have a long history and connection to the place that they live, right? And so you become heightenedly aware of your own existence. So part of his point is like, whiteness is still a privilege, right? But weird things happen to it. It becomes manipulated and changed how that privilege works when we talk about people who expand and settle, right? This is actually quite connected to some of our earlier stuff. Do you guys remember when we were talking about colonialism back when we were reading like Hannah Arendt and stuff like that? Right? We were talking about sort of like the settlers feeling threatened by the population there and reacting, right? In a lot of ways, like this is in some ways talking about a very similar history, our article, but it's talking about it from the perspective of how is it that whiteness is being used, right? How do people perceive themselves as white? How does that tie in, right? So this like fear of non-existence, right, tied in with being surrounded by people who outnumber you often, right, as you settle outwards, right? And this sort of like weird tension. In some ways, like whiteness becomes aware of itself in this situation, right? In a way that when we're talking about people who can predominantly hide from other populations, you know, so like, and the point here being is like more recently, if you're talking about in Australia, more recently the people of Australia experienced this sort of heightened awareness by being around people who are different from them, right, of their own whiteness, but not wholly knowing what to do with that because of it being an empty category, right? In the United States, we don't experience that because essentially we just take minorities and we lock them away on reservations or we lock them in ghettos and we don't really have to interact with them for the most part, which allows us to sort of self-perpetuate this sort of blank, universalistic way of thinking about ourselves. Right? But that becomes in a sort of immediate tension if we're talking about settler populations, right? Because they can't just think of themselves as sort of universal and blank, so there's this immediate sort of like threatening, right, that happens. You guys kind of catch what's happening here? Does that make sense? So that's what our article's kind of pointing to, right? So we have to like, in some ways, take this as a unique, different form of whiteness that still is a form of whiteness, right? It still works on the same lines of privilege, but works differently symbolically for those who experience it. Make sense? Okay, any questions or thoughts? Okay, cool. Great. So that is primarily the primary article that I want to spend time on. We have a shorter article which also was over whiteness, which is this John Harrington article establishing the fact of whiteness. We should take a few moments to look at this as well. So to get into the argument, so this article is more of a critique of the whiteness studies literature. So we're looking at sort of like whiteness studies from the opposite end, if you will. It's still going to claim that we need to study whiteness, but it's uncomfortable with how whiteness studies goes about doing this. So I'm going to have you guys turn to page 497. So we're going to skip over the introduction to whiteness studies since we've already looked at that. And so there's this paragraph that starts, it's on the left-sided column, culture. It starts with the word culture.
Wait, what was the page again?
497. So whenever somebody wants to read, yeah, go ahead.
Culture used definitions of whiteness is used in a twofold manner. Primarily, it establishes a register of individual identity that affects and defines white people collectively, while suggesting a broad range of means by which racial matters influence or inform the lives of white people, asserting that they, too, are racial. Secondly, the notion of white culture developed inconsistent through the long centuries of white global domination reifies whiteness as a definable entity. This moves dangerously close to undermining the basis of social constructionist views of race, because the conviction that there are no inherent affinities between people sharing a collective racial identity is de-established by such a singular, unified definition of whiteness. There are already clearly emerging stretches in the position that race is a social construct, and they partially arise out of the effective demonstrations that racial systems of inequality are inscribed in the very infrastructure of societies in a realm that, while not attaining the permanence of genetic and biological orders, reflects a durability that exceeds single individual interventions or tinkering.
Okay, I'm going to have you pause there. So what is being said? So what's being said about whiteness according to this article in Whiteness Studies, and why is our author feeling uncomfortable with that? Whenever somebody realizes while looking through this. Whenever somebody wants to take a stab at it.
Repeat the question.
So our author in this paragraph, he's talking about something that Whiteness Studies says about whiteness that essentially our author is uncomfortable with. Right? Like, why is that? What is the danger he's seeing in how Whiteness Studies constructs whiteness? Yeah.
Talking like there's no universal one definition of whiteness. Like whiteness is so broad that there's not one way to describe it really.
Yeah. So it doesn't like this like universalizing whiteness, right? So treating whiteness as the same thing, right, in all situations. Right? Because when we're thinking about Dyer and we're thinking about, right, talking about like whiteness is an empty category, whiteness is blank, whiteness is non-existence, right? It's saying that like whether you're white, you know, and you are, you know, I don't know, like a Cockney person in England, or if you're like a white upper class person in Boston, that you have the exact same form of whiteness. Our article's like kind of uncomfortable with that idea, that you can treat whiteness as a sort of universal category with the same meaning, regardless of which group you're talking about. Does anybody catch why he's, so it's not just like, so his argument is not just sort of like, for Harrington, his argument isn't just this like, we're not being specific enough. Is not really his claim, so it's not that like somehow we're abusing white experience. There's something, a different danger to this that he's seeing in this paragraph. Why is it dangerous to treat whiteness as always the same thing in every context? And if people just want to pull a quote out rather than an interpretation, I'm okay with that too. To give you a clue, he even uses the word dangerous once.
Well, it says, this moves dangerously close to the undermining the bias of social constructed views of race.
So yeah, this moves dangerously close to undermining the basis of social constructionist views of race. Right? So what is that saying? Where does race come from? You think about like, this is like our first part of the class. Where does race come from? Is race a real thing? According to most social historians, most sociologists, most people in the humanities. Not really, right? Like it's real because social constructions have real consequences. So you can't just unimagine it. But it's not real in some sort of like physical, material sense, right? So our author wants to claim this sort of like universalizing the meaning of whiteness undermines social constructionist views of race. So undermines this idea that race is just a social construction. So why? Right after that comes the word because. Maybe a good place to start with the why. Why does it undermine the social constructionist view of race? Yeah.
So it's the conviction that there are no inherent enemies between people sharing a collective racial identity is destabilized by such a singular unified definition of whiteness.
Anybody want to take a stab at what that means? Where does an ethnic identity come from if you're thinking constructivistically? How do we get to an ethnic identity? social constructivism, people create meaning together, right? This is kind of the idea, right? So by envisioning whiteness as this sort of universal thing, what we're ignoring is that whiteness essentially should be thought of as a collection of people out of which their perceptions of whiteness, of themselves as white people, grow, right? And that in reality, like, you know, our social structure creates constraints, right? But when we're talking about identities of individual ethnicities, they grow out of the experiences of those groups of people, right? So the idea is it's in people talking about, thinking about, interacting, that these grow, right? Whiteness still is privilege, it's still domination, but it's a form of domination that is created amongst white people, right, as they go about existing in the world, right? So it changes, and it's different from place to place, and it has to be subject to that, or otherwise you sort of create this universal, unchanging category of whiteness. That's its criticism of whiteness studies. So if we were just to think, how should you go about studying something like whiteness from Harrington's perspective? How would it differ? Like, so rather than sort of like these large sort of theoretical claims, yeah?
There'd be more specificity between groups of white people.
Yeah. You should be looking at the small local context in which whiteness is being constructed, right? That's essentially Harrington's claim. Make sense? So that's his critique of it, is that like it undermines this basis, which basically, like, by undermining social constructionist views of race, in some ways the argument is that it runs the risk of perpetuating, right, a racialized way of understanding the world. Make sense? Cool. Wonderful. Any questions on whiteness before we close up for the day? Final thoughts, confusions people have. If not, have a great day. See you guys next week.